So although these are, as I said last time, heady times of the year, with Yom Kippur very, very soon, we have a Seder in learning Pirkei Avot, which we will continue to do today, and we come to the second Mishnah. So we've discussed at some length the first Mishnah. We saw the transmission of Torah from Moshe to Yeshua, to the Zakanim, to the Nevi'im, to the Anshe Knesset HaGadola, to the men of the Great Assembly. We saw what the men of the Great Assembly taught us, and now we come on to sort of an epilogue to the story of the men of the Great Assembly, because Mishnah Bet starts by saying, Shimon HaTzadik Haya Mishiyarei Knesset HaGadola. Shimon HaTzadik was one of the remnants, or one of the last of the Knesset HaGadola. And what did he do? Hu Haya Omer, he said, Al Shalosha Devarim HaOlam Omed. The world stands on three things, Al HaTorah, Val HaAvodah, Ugemilut Chasadim. On Torah, on Avodah, service, we'll see soon a particular type of service, and Gemilut Chasadim, acts of kindness. So we might already notice that we had three statements from the Anshe Knesset HaGadola. We have three statements from Shimon HaTzadik, and we're going to find lots of trios of statements in Pirkei Avot. We already saw a reason from the Maharal why that should be so. And we're going to learn more about Shimon HaTzadik and who he was and when he was, and perhaps that will help us understand why he said what he said. So I think we'll go straight to we'll go straight to number 3, because it's worth pointing out there's a Mishnah at the end of the Perek, which we'll discuss a long time in the future. But let's just look at it now because it sheds light on our Mishnah. So in number 3 we read Mishnah Yud Chet, which says as follows: Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel Omer, Al Shalosha Devarim HaOlam Kayam. On Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says, on three things the world endures or goes on. Now notice straight away there's a parallel with what we had from Shimon HaTzadik. He had three things on which the world stands, and Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel has three things on which the world continues or endures. What are the three things, Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel? Al Hadin, Val Ha'emet, Val Ha'shalom. On Din, judgment; on Emet, truth; and on Shalom, peace. And then he brings a pasuk to confirm that. So I don't want to get into that one now because we'll get to it in the right place when we get to Mishnah Yud Chet. But it's just worth pointing out that Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel in Mishnah Yud Chet has three things in which the world endures, goes on. So that sheds light on Shlosha Davarim Ha'olam Omed, three things in which the world stands. So Shimon HaTzadik can't be talking about three things that keep the world going, because Shimon ben Gamliel is talking about three things that keep the world going. So Shimon HaTzadik is talking about the three things on which the world was established. In other words, why it was created. It was created for the sake of Torah, Avodah, and Gemilut Chasadim, which we'll now explain. So I think we'll look at the Bartanura in number 5. As I said, the Bartanura is usually the first place we go to understand a Mishnah anywhere in Shas. Oh, I'm sorry. And so the Bartanura gives us some explanation, not the only explanation, as we will see, about what we're talking about here. So he says in number 5, first line, Ha'olam Omed, three things on which the world stands. Lo nivra ha'olam eila bishvil shalosh davarim halalu. The world was only created for the sake of these three things. He phrases it in the negative. We'll take out the double negative and translate it as the world was created for the sake of only these three things. And that fits in what I said a moment ago, in that by comparing it to Mishnah Yud Chet, he's telling us the Mishnah Bet gives the three things on which the world stands. In other words, the three things which was the reason for the creation of the world in the first place. And now he goes into more detail about which one, what they all mean. Al HaTorah. What does he mean by the world was created because of the Torah? She'imale lo kiblu Yisrael et HaTorah, lo nivru shamayim va'aretz. Because if the Jewish people had not accepted the Torah, then heaven and earth would not have been created. And we have a pasuk to confirm that. Dichtiv, the pasuk in Yirmiyahu says, Im lo briti yamam v'layla, chukat shamayim va'aretz lo samti. if it were not for my covenant, in other words, with the Jewish people, day and night, in other words, they're doing something day and night, not quite clear what, and then chukat shemaim, the laws of heaven and earth, I would not have placed. I would not have created heaven and earth if it were not for my covenant, which the TORAH understands as the fact that the Jews accepted the Torah.
But the word she'ilmaleh refers to the Jewish people and not...
Here it refers to the Jewish people's acceptance of the Torah. If it hadn't been for the Jewish people accepting the Torah, then the world wouldn't have been created. Okay, then he continues in number 6, al ha'avodah. What do we mean by service? Avodat hakorbanot. So straight away we'll say, and there's no dispute about this, we mean the service of sacrifices. The word avodah means a lot of different things, but often in rabbinic literature it means what goes on in the Bet Mikdash, the offering of sacrifices. And why was that a pillar on which the world stands? Shekach shaninu b'mesechet Ta'anit. We've learned in the Gemara in Ta'anit, she'imale ma'amadot lo nitkaima sheme'em va'aretz. Now, the ma'amadot are actually people who stand to represent their communities when it comes to the sacrifices. We don't need to get into that. It's an indirect reference to the sacrifices themselves. So the Gemara is saying, if it weren't for the sacrifices, then heaven and earth would not endure. So again, we see that sacrifices are a prerequisite for the creation of the earth. Umatzini continues, second line in number 6. Umatzinu shebishvil hakarbanot shehikriv Noach nishba hakadosh baruch hu shelo yavi mabul la'olam. So we have a very clear example of how sacrifices are essential to the continuation of the world. Namely, Noach. Hashem chose to destroy humanity, but to start again from Noach. Noah comes out of the teva. What does he do? He offers sacrifices. And Hashem says, because the sacrifices you offer, they were so good, they were super sacrifices, the result will be, I will not bring another flood. So we see a connection between sacrifices and the world existing. And the third thing that Shimon HaTzadik tells us about is in the 4th line of number 6, Al Gemilot Chasodim. Acts of kindness are also a prerequisite for the world to exist. Tichtiv Olam Chesed Yibaneh. Hashem builds a world of chesed, of kindness. Ugemilut chasadim hu l'sameach chatanim. What does it mean, gemilot chasadim? It means to make a couple happy at their wedding. Ulenachem avelim, to bring consolation to mourners. Ulevakir cholim, and to visit the sick. Ulikbor meitim, and to bury the dead. V'kiyotzi behen, and similarly other examples. So the TORAH is doing what he normally does, which is giving a explanation of what the Mishnah is talking about. But there's a particular thing that the TORAH said in number 5 that the Tosfot Yom Tov has something to say on in number 7. The Tosfot Yom Tov appears in the Mishnah, so usually sort of opposite the TORAH, and the Tosfot Yom Tov, amongst other things, sometimes questions the TORAH's explanation, and he has a problem with something the TORAH said here. So in number 7, the Tosfot Yom Tov says, on the words Al HaTorah, and he says, Peirush ha-Reish Bet, which refers to the TORAH. So the TORAH has explained, She'imale lo kiblu Yisrael et HaTorah, lo nivru shemayim va'aretz. If the Jewish people had not accepted the Torah, the heaven and earth would not be created. Now, you might have noticed already, the way the TORAH explained the three things, there is a significant difference between what he says about Torah and what he says about Avodah and what he says about Gilma Chasadim. Because when it comes to Torah, he says, the TORAH said in number 5, that refers to a particular historical moment. What was that historical moment? When the Jews accepted the Torah. Had they not accepted the Torah, the world wouldn't have existed. When it comes to Korbanot, it's the ongoing practice of sacrifices. When it comes to Gemilot Chasadim, it's the ongoing practice of kindness. But when it comes to Torah, says the TORAH, referring to the one-off event of the acceptance of the Torah. So the Tosfot Yom Tov, back to number 7, says, we'll start in the middle of line 2. He quotes the TORAH and he says, Ulafisha huksha lo, da'avoda u'gemilot chasodim, hainu Torah. Says the Tosfot Yom Tov that the TORAH had a problem with this Mishnah. Because, and I already said, I've pointed out, but he explains Torah in a slightly strange way. And says the Tosfot Yom Tov, the problem is, What do we mean by Torah? If we hadn't read the Bartanura, we would assume that Torah means practicing the Torah, fulfilling the mitzvot of the Torah. And what do those mitzvot include? They include avodah, offering sacrifices. They include gemilut chasodim, acts of kindness. Some people have this mistaken idea that acts of kindness are like separate from the Torah. He keeps the laws of the Torah, and he's also a very kind person. Well, if he keeps the laws of the Torah, he is a very kind person. Goes without saying, one's absolutely included in the other. It's not the totality of what's in the whole Torah, but it's a major part of the whole Torah. So says the Tosfos Yom Tov. But the Bartanura looks at these three things and says, I've got a problem. Torah includes avodah and gemilut chasodim. So why does the Mishnah list Torah as separate from avodah or gemilut chasodim? And the Tosfos Yom Tov thinks that Bartanura's answer is that's why he explains Torah as referring to a historical event and not the practice of Torah. He explains, as we saw, that Torah is the acceptance of Torah, a one-off event in history, not to be confused with keeping the Torah, because that's covered by things like avodah and gemilut chasodim. So the Tosfos Yom Tov gives us that insight into the Bartanura's thinking. But he doesn't agree. And he says, now go to the fourth line of number 7 in the middle of the line. V'kashali. And I've got a problem with the way the Bartanura is dealing with this. She'im kein kol ha-Torah she'amar eino azhara klal. In which case, when Shimon HaTzadik talks about Torah, there's no literally warning, there's no instruction, there's no something that we have to do. Ve'eino doma le'inach, and it's not like the other two. When it comes, Shimon HaTzadik says, you've got to do avodah. I know what that means. I've got to go to the Bet Mikdash, I've got to offer sacrifices. Shimon HaTzadik says, you've got to do gemilut chasodim. I know what that means. I've got to be kind to people. I've got to visit the sick. I've got to bury the dead. Shimon HaTzadik says, we've got to do Torah. But the Bartanura said Torah means something that happened 3,000 years ago. It doesn't happen anymore, the acceptance of Torah on Har Sinai. So,
What about the fact that we're not giving korbanot anymore?
We'll come to that.
Oh, good.
Don't worry, we'll cover that. Hopefully today. If not today, next time. Yeah. So the Tosfos Yom Tov thinks that it doesn't make sense for Shimon HaTzadik to be saying, you've got to know about Torah if it doesn't involve keeping the Torah. For Shimon HaTzadik to say, you've got to know about Torah, and the Bartanura says that means you've got to understand that 3,000 years ago the Jews accepted the Torah, that doesn't make sense. It's got to be something that impacts on us today. So he says in line 5 and number 7, V'lakach nira li ha-Torah hi hegion v'limud ha-Torah. Therefore, I think that what Shimon HaTzadik says, the Torah is one of the things the world stands on. It's the ongoing study of Torah. It is, in this case, distinct from the practice of Torah, because that's covered by avodah and gemilut chasodim, but it means the study of Torah. So what does Torah mean if it doesn't mean keeping the mitzvot? It means learning Torah. And that's what the Tosfos Yom Tov, think is pshat, is the explanation of the word Torah in the Mishnah. And he brings a nice proof for this. And he says, end of line 5, V'hainu dichtiv im lo beriti yomon v'layla. Now, we missed out a bit where he said, that pasuk in Yirmiyahu that the Gemara quotes, if it weren't for my Brit day and night. So the Bartanura seems to be reading that as my covenant, which was established when the Jewish people accepted the Torah. And he sort of rereads that pasuk. But says the Bartanura, says the Tosfos Yom Tov, look, the pasuk says, im lo beriti yomon v'layla. Ki'inyan shneimar, like we have another pasuk that says in Yoshua, v'higita bo yomon v'layla. You shall study it day and night. What's the it there? Torah. So yomon v'layla, he says, is a sort of connection. That the pasuk about, I wouldn't have created the world if it weren't for my covenant yomon v'layla, that yomon v'layla is compared to the yomon v'layla by Yoshua, which refers to the study of Torah. So that's what I wanted to show from these two commentators. Rav Avadia believes that Torah means the acceptance of Torah that took place at Har Sinai. It's a one-off historical event. The Tosfos Yom Tov questioned that and says that doesn't make such sense to me because it should be something that impacts upon us today. We're dealing with a slight technical problem in the Mishnah that Torah cannot include avodah and gemilut chasodim. It must be something distinct. And therefore, Bartanura says it's the acceptance of Torah that took place historically, and Tosfos Yom Tov says it's the study of Torah that we have to do day and night. Okay. I want to, let's go. I was going to miss over number 8, but since you asked the question, well, let's look at number 8. The Tosfos Yom Tov continues to explain, and he says, Al ha'avoda, regarding the sacrifices, the sacrificial procedures that took place in the Bet Mikdash. He says, Ve'im tomar, if you were to say, and he's actually quoting the Gemara, Teinach bizman shebeit hamikdash kayam, that's okay when the temple stood. Aval mishacharev my ikalamema. But now it's been destroyed and we can't offer sacrifices. What can we say? Sounds like a big problem. It is a big problem. If the world stands on sacrifices and now we can't offer sacrifices, what's going to happen to the world? So that's the question. It's actually the Gemara's question. And he says, you might be worried about this reading this Mishnah. So he says in the second line, you could say that the world was created looking forward to the fact that there would be a Bet Mikdash. There isn't any more, but there was a Bet Mikdash, and that justified the world's creation. V'od, and something else, I think a better answer. Shaharei siyam ha'ma'ama hanizkar, the reference to the avoda, the Torah, the korbanot being a source for the existence of the world. Amar lefanav tevach mizman, he quotes the Gemara, sorry, he's just giving you the reference. V'hashiva kavar tiknati lahem seder korbanot, says Hashem, even without the Bet Mikdash, I have set up for them the seder, the order of sacrifices. I fixed that for them. What does it mean, the order of sacrifices? It comes clear in the next few words, end of line 3. Kol zaman shakorin bahem, whenever they read them, they, the Jewish people, read about the sacrifices, ma'aleh ani alehen ki'ilu makriven lefanai korban. When the Jewish people learn the laws of sacrifices, it's as if they have offered them. This, by the way, is a big principle that extends beyond sacrifices, but it's an important point because of the importance of the Bet Mikdash. The truth is, when we sit and learn Gemara, there's a lot of halacha which is not relevant to us today, because Baruch Hashem, we're living in the land of Israel, but we still don't have a Bet Mikdash. The Kedusha of Eretz Israel may or may not be the same as it was in the past. There's lots of mitzvahs that don't apply anymore. Yet we still learn about them. Why do we learn about them? Well, one reason is in Yitz Hashem they will apply soon and we better be ready. But another reason is, by learning about them, it's equivalent on some level to performing them. So by learning about mitzvah, even though the mitzvah are no longer applicable and will be again in the future, by learning about them, it's as if we are performing them. And the classic and the most significant example is korbanot themselves. So when we learn in the Gemara, in the Sifrei Halacha, about the korbanot, it's as close as we can get to offering them. I'll just point out that the Seder korbanot is written in the Siddur, where at the very beginning of Shacharit, before Baruch Shema, we learn about the sacrifices. We say a peruk of Mishnah that details the place and the procedure for every one of the sort of key sacrifices. It's unfortunate that many people who don't come to shul quite on time, as the joke goes, the first thing they sacrifice are the sacrifices. And as you can see from what we've just learned here, that's a big mistake. Because if the world only stands because there are sacrifices, and the way that we get the equivalent of fulfilling that today is by reading and learning about the sacrifices, and Chazal put it in the Siddur at the beginning of our day, and we miss that out, it's not brilliant for the world. So, please note, at the beginning of Shacharit, that's where we learn and we say the sacrifices, which is the equivalent, the Gemara uses the word equivalent, to performing the sacrifices.
She wants to ask a question.
Yes, I'm sorry.
Shimon, when Shimon HaTzadik was alive, Bet Mikdash was around.
Okay. Well, that's a good segue into what we're going to do right now. Okay. Well, by the way, there is a simple answer to that. Is that, Shimon HaTzadik said, you've got to offer sacrifices, and we also have to fit in an interpretation of how we do that today. Because Shimon HaTzadik said, sacrifices are one of the 3 pillars of the world, so we've got to find a way that we can maintain that pillar. But there is a better answer. And yes?
I thought that tefillah, that davening, replaced the sacrifices, what you're saying.
Yeah, that's another.
Incorporate.
That's another answer that's given. That's another answer that's given. That the avoda shebalev, the avoda in our heart, is well, it's certainly in a sense, in this temporary phase when we don't have a Bet Mikdash, it has replaced the avoda on the Bet Mikdash. I think you can find a source that says it's equivalent to offering sacrifices, but that's not quite what we said here. Okay, the Abarbanel, whom I named this time, Nachalat Avot LaAbarbanel.
On 9.
Yep, on number 9. Thank you for pointing that out. He, interestingly enough, I mean, as I've said many times, he has a lot to say, and I've just extracted a few paragraphs. But these few paragraphs, they start with a history lesson, a biography. And it's interesting that the Abarbanel goes off on quite a long tangent to tell us all about Shimon HaTzadik, and in particular to tell us about the time frame in which he was operating, and that's what we're going to see now. And then we'll find out why the Abarbanel felt it important to give us this history lesson. So he says in number 9, Ukadai haya zeh ha'ma'amar la'amar oto shahaya Shimon HaTzadik. Mishare v'achrona anshe Knesset Hagadola. It's Kedai, it's appropriate that it was Shimon HaTzadik, who was one of the last of the Anshe Knesset Hagadola, who said these things, who said what he said in the Mishnah. And exactly why it was appropriate, it'll take a little while to get to, but we will get to it. He says, Ukavar katavti shahaya Kohen Gadol chasid v'yirei shamayim. I've already written that this Shimon HaTzadik was not just a rabbi, I suppose, a member of the Knesset Hagadola. He was a Kohen Gadol, and he was a chassid, and he was Yirei Shamayim. And that's particularly, it's worth saying, because not every Kohen Gadol, particularly during Bayit Sheni, which, as we will see, is when Shimon HaTzadik was functioning, not every Kohen Gadol was a chassid and Yirei Shamayim. It was a time, particularly at the later part of Bayit Sheni, that people would buy from the Roman the Roman governors the right to be Kohen Gadol, and they would not do a very good job, and they would not be very sincere, and often they didn't live out their time because they went into the Kodesh Kodoshim on Yom Kippur, and if they weren't fitting, they didn't necessarily come out, at least not...
You mean Kohanim bought from the Romans?
Yep.
So the Romans had control of the temple?
Yes. Well, when they were in control of the whole province, they were the masters. Yep, it was bad time. Anyway, so that's why the Abarbanel points out that this Shimon HaTzadik, he wasn't like necessarily some of the other Kohanim Gedolim, he was a chassid v'yirei shamayim. V'haya nikra gamkein Hananya, and he also had another name that sometimes you find in the sources. He was called Hananya. Who says that? Kedivrei Yosefan. Who is Yosefan? Josephus, whom... he was one of us, then he went over to the other side, but his books...
My husband had his farm.
Okay. His books are pretty important, and fascinatingly, archaeology, as far as I understand, is confirming generally what Josephus wrote in his books. So it's not inappropriate to quote him. Anyway, Va'aviv Nikra Yeshua. Now we're talking not about Josephus, but we're back to Shimon HaTzadik. His father was called Yeshua. Sheba im Zerubbabel livnot Tebayit, who came back with Zerubbabel to build the second Beit Mikdash. So we've talked a lot about this, and the Anshe Knesset Gedolah, we've said, existed sort of at the time of the transition from Bayit Rishon to Bayit Sheni, with 70 years of exile in between. And we're now told by the Abarbanel that Shimon HaTzadik was one generation after the start of the Second Temple, because his father was one of those who came back from Babel to build the Second Temple, and then he had a son who was Shimon HaTzadik. Shehu haya ben Yehotzadak, shahaya Kohen Gadol b'mei Tzidkiyahu melech Yehuda. The father of Shimon HaTzadik was himself the son of another person who had been a Kohen Gadol back in the time of the kings at the end of Bayit Rishon. Sorry?
Yehotzadak was Shimon HaTzadik's father?
I think grandfather.
Grandfather.
If I read it correctly.
And Tzidkiyahu
was the king. It was one of the last kings.
And that was not related to Shimon HaTzadik?
No.
So, according to this, Ezra was his uncle?
We'll get to Ezra in a moment. We'll just give me a moment. But let's go back to, Va'oto Yehotzadik, haya aviv shel Ezra HaSofer. Were you reading ahead? So this Yehotzadak, who was the grandfather of Shimon HaTzadik, was himself the father of Ezra. So as you say, Ezra was therefore his uncle.
He's in the lineage.
He said it's a good yichus. It's a good yichus. Line 3 on our page. V'Shimon HaTzadik hashalem hazeh shemesh b'kona gedola 40 shana. And Shimon HaTzadik served for 40 years as Kohen Gadol, which is a long time, especially, as I said, towards the end of Bayit Sheni. Most of the candidates for Kohen Gadol didn't live out a year. Kamosha Nizkar Masechet Yoma, we're told about him in that part of the Gemara. Na'asu lo nisim gedolim, there were many great miracles that were done for him while he was the Kohen Gadol. But avodah Beit HaMikdash, in the avodah took place in the Beit Mikdash. For instance, for Goral Haya Ole Biyamim, Shayach to Yom Kippur in 2 days' time, there was a lottery to which of the goats would be used as the scapegoat and which would be sacrificed to Hashem. And the way the lottery worked is the Kohen Gadol would put his hands in a box and put out 2 kalpiot, 2 ballot papers, as we would say today. And it was a zechut if the one in his right hand said La Hashem, which he would then put on the head of the goat on his right side, and that would be sacrificed, as opposed to the other goat, which would be sent away. So it was a good thing if the goral that said La Hashem came up in his right hand. And it happened every time. For Shimon HaTzadik, for one of the 40 years that he observed at Yom Kippur, the goral came up in his right hand. I think I will jump over, because we don't need to go through all the details of all the other miracles that were done for him, but he was a really, really special guy. He was a Kohen Gadol, he acted with integrity, and he was rewarded with miracles.
Excuse me, but the time frame doesn't work out.
Well,
if you're saying he lived at the time of the Romans,
no, I
he's
didn't.
the grandson, and he's the nephew of Ezra, well, you've got an enormous time period.
You're quite right, but I didn't mean to say he lived at the time of the Romans. I said later on in the time of the Romans, when the Romans took over Judea, they controlled who was Kohen Gadol. But he was before that time. Okay? Long time before. Yep. But thank you for pointing that out. Okay. Now, in his time, there was a major event which had huge repercussions, and he played a part in it. Paragraph 10. Ubizmano ba Alexandros Mukdan. Who's Alexandros Mukdan? Alexander the Great. Al Yerushalayim. He came with an army against Yerushalayim. Sheyetzei mi'aretzo Macedonia. He came from his land of Macedonia. Lihilachem b'Darius melech Paras, to wage war on Darius, the king of Persia. So this is the war between the Macedonians and the Persians, and it was a big war which Alexander eventually won. But before we get to that, he came to wage war on end of line 1, beginning of line 2. Melech Paras oyavo, his enemy, ulachriv kol b'nei brito. And as was the way in ancient times, he wanted to defeat his enemy and to defeat all the allies of that enemy. Uka'asher ba'al Yerushalayim haya evol gadol leYehudim. And when Alexander came to Yerushalayim, there was great mourning amongst the Jews. You'll recognize these words, which are borrowed from Megillat Esther. V'tzom u'bechi u'misped. And there was fasting, and there was crying, and there was eulogies. There was general terror and fear. Pein yachriv et ha'ir ve'et ha'migdash, lest Alexander destroy the city and destroy the Bet Mikdash. B'kocho gvurato v'rov chayal, with his strength and with his multitudinous army. Ki balei brit v'nichnaim hayu b'nei Yehuda le Darius melech Paras, because the people of Yehuda, that's what was left of Israel after the 10 northern tribes disappeared, the people of Yehuda were allies of the Persian king Darius. Darius, sorry, I'm not remembering all the details of the time frame at the end of the exile, but the Persians had now given permission for the Jews to go back and rebuild the Bet Mikdash. That was the time frame. Alexander the Great was a little bit later, and I do question the chronology here a little bit, because I think the time frame between the beginning of Bayit Sheni and Alexander is a bit longer than sort of sounds like here. The Gemara tells us that Shimon HaTzadik lived a very long time, and that might be relevant in order to make him there at the same time as Alexander. But Alexander comes to wage war on the Persians. The Jews are allied with the Persians. The Jews are now afraid that Alexander will therefore destroy them like he wants to destroy the Persians. And that's why they're very worried that he will come and destroy Yerushalayim and destroy the Bet Mikdash. Middle of line 4. V'yezaku el Hashem b'tzar lahem. And they cried out to Hashem because of the troubles that they had. Ubehegia Alexandrus el Pnei Yerushalayim. And when Alexander came to the face of Yerushalayim, here we have this event which is described in detail in the Gemara. Yatsa elav Shimon HaTzadik. Shimon HaTzadik came out to greet Alexander. Malavush b'shmona bagadim, wearing his entire priestly garb, all the 8 garments. V'imo ziknei Yerushalayim, lihitchanein lefanav, and with him were the elders of Yerushalayim to implore before him, to plead with Alexander not to destroy the city and the Bet Mikdash. But what happened was as follows. Uka'asher ra'a Alexandrus et HaKohen HaGadol, when Alexander saw Shimon HaTzadik, Yorad mehar merkava, he descended from his chariot, v'hishtachaveh lefanav. What a plot twist. Alexander, instead of demanding Shimon HaTzadik bow to Alexander, the reverse happened. Alexander bowed to Shimon HaTzadik. V'amar l'malachim l'sarim asher ito. And he said to the kings and the officers who were with him, who must have been amazed at this turn of events, Al titmahu mima sha'ani oseh. Don't be surprised at what I'm doing. Ki yadua teidu shetzurat ha'ish hazeh ani ro'eh tamid. Because you should know that I have seen the image of this man, this Shimon HaTzadik, without knowing who he was. I've seen him tamid lefanai b'milchamot sha'ani notzeach. I've always seen him before me in the wars in which I've been victorious. So Hashem had prepared the way for the Jews to survive even when Alexander the Great and the Greeks come to Eretz Israel. Alexander did not destroy the city because he revered Shimon HaTzadik, because Hashem had sent him images of Shimon HaTzadik before Alexander's regular victories.
Saying that Hashem, that the refuah was prepared before the
Absolutely. Absolutely. V'gam, and he continues to say, 3 lines from the end. V'gam halayla hazot re'iti tumunato le'neged aynai b'chalom chazayon layla. And even just now, just last night, says Alexander, I saw his image in a vision of the night, in a dream. V'tziva oti b'chalomi la'asot kain. And he commanded, I'm not quite sure if that's Shimon HaTzadik or Hashem, commanded me in my dream to do so, to bow before him. And then, obviously, Shimon HaTzadik sees this as a good time to ask for favor. He says, please don't destroy Yerushalayim. And that the people of Yehuda should now be allies of him, of Alexander. And Alexander agreed to do so. And that is the way the Gemara tells the story of Alexander. We identify him with the Greeks, even though technically he was from Macedonia, but this was the beginning of the time when the Greeks came to Eretz Yisrael. Now, a few things to say. So we often talk about the 4 kingdoms that took over Eretz Yisrael. There have been more than 4, but the 4 played a very special part. The Babylonians, who were replaced by the Persians, who were replaced by the Greeks, who were replaced by the Romans. Actually, between the Greeks and the Romans, there was a short period when the Jews were in charge of themselves. That was after the rebellion of the Maccabees, but that's for Hanukkah. Another thing for Hanukkah is to talk about the interrelationship between Torah and Hellenism. This was the starting point. This was when the Greeks came to Israel. Now, the Greeks came to Israel initially in harmony, and that's what we've just been learning about. That's what just happened. Alexander didn't destroy anything. He let the Jews do what they wanted to do. The Gemara says that year, as a mark of respect for Alexander, all the baby boys that were born were called Alexander. Alexander is a Jewish name. It doesn't sound very Jewish. It sounds a bit Greek, but it's actually a Jewish name for this reason. I often wonder, and this is my school principal experience, what would happen when the teacher takes the register that day. Every day in the following years, if she asks, is Alexander present here? Then she's going to have problems because every baby boy was called Alexander for that year. Anyway, so at the beginning, Alexander comes. Shimon HaTzadik is there. Alexander brings Greek ideas and Greek culture. And initially, there is some sort of harmonious relationship between Torah and Greek culture. The Greeks feel right at home in Jerusalem. Later on, it changes. And we know that by the time we get to the Hanukkah story, the Greeks and the Jews are not fitting in so well, and there's a big clash of armies, a clash of national sovereignty, and a clash of culture and ideas. But that's for Hanukkah. The point that the Abarbanel is stressing here is that Shimon HaTzadik was there when the Greeks came in, at the beginning of Bayit Sheni. Not quite the beginning. The beginning of Bayit Sheni was the Babylonians and the Persians, and then later on the Greeks. So if we go on to number 11. Number 11. Nireh shehamaforshim lo daktaku gerui beloshon Mishnah. Now, I've missed out a long section. He quotes various other people explaining what's the significance of the three things that Shimon HaTzadik talks about. And now the Abarbanel says, that's all very interesting, but I think all those Meforshim have got it wrong. I will tell you what these three things are and their historical significance and their connection and the appropriateness of Shimon HaTzadik being their author. And he says, Hanir Eli, end of line 1 of number 11. What seems to me, ba shehu she'im nefaresh heim amru gimel heim amru shlosha devarim al hanaviyim kamosha parashti lamala. So let me remind us what we said last week, that the Abarbanel had this interesting way of explaining the first Mishnah. The first Mishnah says, I remind you, Moshe received the Torah from Sinai, he handed it over to Yehoshua to the Zakanim to the Nevi'im to Anshe Knesset HaGadolah, and they said three things. And the Abarbanel said, who's the they? Everyone thinks the they is the Anshe Knesset HaGadolah. But the Abarbanel thinks that the they is the Nevi'im. And he thinks the Nevi'im were giving a message to the Anshe Knesset HaGadolah. At the time of transition from the Nevi'im to the Chachamim, the Nevi'im were telling the Chachamim, these are three things you've got to be careful about. So says the Abarbanel, the same thing is happening at the next stage in our Mishnah. The Nevi'im said to the Anshe Knesset Gedolah, times are changing, there's no more Nevuah, therefore you've got to be aware of these three things that were happening in Mishnah Aleph. And Shimon HaTzadik is at the end of the Knesset HaGadolah, he's handing over to the next group, and he's got a message for them. So just as the Nevi'im handed a message to the Anshe Knesset Gedolah, that's what the Abarbanel explains. So the end of the Anshe Knesset Gedolah, who was Shimon HaTzadik, passes a message to those who come after him. So, I'll just jump to end of line 3 of number 11. Rui Lafaresh, Shimon HaTzadik, Lefisha Haya Mishari Knesset Gedolah. So therefore, it's fitting to explain that Shimon HaTzadik, because he was at the end of the Anshe Knesset Gedolah, Rotzeh Lomar me'achronim shebehem, that means at the end, the last of them. So he's also at a time of transition. Asa gam kein kacha, he did the same as the Nevi'im did. Shesipa berucho v'chachmato. Shachachmei Yisrael hayodin ha'atidin lavo begalut. He saw with his spirit and his wisdom. Interesting, he puts the two together because they're not the same thing. Spirit is like a special indication you get from Hashem, and Chachma is what you work out for yourselves. He worked out, but the time was coming when the Chachmei Yisrael hayatidin lavo begalut, that this period of the Bayit Sheni was not going to last forever. We've already got the Greeks. We can see, somebody who's very prescient can see that the future is not going to be rosy, and we're going to go into exile. And even the sages of Israel are going to go into exile. Umalka v'sareha b'goyim ein Torah. And the king and the ministers will be amongst the nations where there will be no Torah. V'gam tibatel avodat Beit HaMikdash. And even though Shimon HaTzadik was at the time of the Bet Mikdash, the second Bet Mikdash, he is foreseeing a time when there will be no more avodah in the Bet Mikdash. He was, I'd say, the way the Abarbanel is describing it, he was a visionary who looks at what's happening to him now, namely the arrival of the Greeks, and sees that this is not going to end well. There's going to be a time of Galut and Batel Bet Mikdash, and cancellation of what goes on in the Bet Mikdash. So in the middle of line 6, V'tzipa gam kein inyan hapritzim v'posha Yisrael shehiyu begalut. He also saw that there's going to be, when they're in exile, Jews going, as we would say today, off the derech. Pritzim is really sort of going through the wall. Today we'd say off the derech. They're going to be affected in not a good way. V'lachein hishtadel ha'chiziram al kol zeh. And therefore he tried to warn them, to prepare them for all this. Betito limud no'er u'musar hechrachi lechochmei hamishna haboim acharav. And he wanted to give a message to the scholars and the scholars of the Mishnah who came after him, Kamosha asu achrone hanavim, just like, as I said, says the Abarbanel, that the Nevi'im, at the end of the period of the Nevuah, gave a message, L'Anshe Knesset Gedola, Haboim Achareihem, who came after them. So, we're about to get to paragraph 12, where I actually dissect all these three things, but the scene that he is setting is that Shimon HaTzadik is preparing for a bleak future. A future when there will be exile, a future when Jews will be mixed up in other cultures, and I think that's the implication of the arrival of the Greeks, and when the Jews will be in places where there is no Torah, and where there'll be no more Bet Mikdash. So he's saying, listen to people of my generation, I'm now the end of the Anshe Knesset HaGadola, it's a period of transition, be prepared for a difficult future. And how do you prepare for the difficult future? These three things. Paragraph 12. Ukamo sha hanavim hizhiru la'anshe knesset hagedola al shleisha inyanim. And just like we saw in the first Mishnah, that, as explained by the Abarbanel, the Nevi'im warned the Anshe Knesset Gedola about three matters, Shaheim, and those three matters were Havei Matunim Badin, be deliberate in judgment, v'chule, etc. Kacha Shimon HaTzadik liyoto me'achreina Anshe Knesset HaGedola his here lahochmei HaMishnah haboim acharav begimel devorim acherim. So he is going to also follow the pattern of giving three important points, but they're different points. Now, we will see later how we can perhaps match up Shimon HaTzadik's three things to the Anshe Knesset Gedola's three things, because it's not hard to make them match up. But the Abarbanel is not saying they match up. He's saying, on the contrary, they are different things because they apply at a different time, a time of transition, but a different transition. So for Shimon HaTzadik, the three things are, middle of line 3,
So you're quoting Abarbanel?
Yes.
This says La Mahara.
no, paragraph 12.
Oh, you're 12.
You're ahead of me.
I thought you were 13.
You've jumped ahead. So we're still in the Maharal. So the Maharal, as I said, gave us 2 paragraphs of history, but he needed to give it as 2 paragraphs of history because he thinks that the comments of Shimon HaTzadik are very appropriate to the times in which he lived. So the 3 things that he stressed, middle of line 3 of paragraph 12, Al HaTorah v'al Avodah v'al Gemilut Chasodim. Ke'ilu amar hizhiru b'shmirat HaTorah. As if he was saying, take care to preserve and guard the Torah. Pen tavo l'dei minut v'apikursa, lest it come into heresy. And apikursim, people who've got a different agenda, the kefira kabbalat HaTorah, and people who deny the reception and the recipients of the Torah Shebal Peh. As we know, that in the time of Bayit Sheni, as well as the Chochmei HaMishnah, the great sages of the Torah Shebal Peh, there were people who took a different path. There were the Sadducees, there were other subgroups who said, in particular, their particular bone of contention with the Torah true Jews was about the Torah Shebal Peh, the oral Torah, of which the Mishnah is really the fulfillment, the manifestation. So at the very same time that the Mishnah was being developed in the period of Bayit Sheni, that was the time when people were saying, we don't believe in the Torah Shebal Peh, we don't follow what the Chachamim are telling us. So Shimon HaTzadik is saying, be careful to avoid these snares, these traps, these heretical influences by being careful about the Torah. So that's why the Torah is the first thing that Shimon HaTzadik lists. And the second thing, so this is the 5th line of number 12, his hiru ba'avodot Beit HaMikdash, be careful, be protective of the service in the Bet Mikdash, pen yavo ha'oyevim v'yabatluha, lest the enemies come and negate it and cancel it. So we said in the previous paragraph, he knows it's going to happen. Doesn't necessarily mean it's going to happen now, but while we still have a Bet Mikdash, preserve it, look after it, perform the sacrifices in the way they should be performed. That's why the second of his pillars is avodah. And then he said, end of line 5, his hiru b'gemilat chasodim. Also, be particular in acts of kindness. Pen yakumu ha'puritzim v'yahargu ish bara'ehu. B'makat cherev v'hereg v'avdon. Lest those Jews who've literally broken through, who've gone away from Torah true Judaism create not just an argument, but a civil war in which they kill people and they smite them with the sword, and they kill them and they are lost. And it sounds pretty extreme, and as I'm saying, it sounds pretty extreme. We introduced the idea that there were Jews who had different ideas. Suddenly we're saying there's going to be a civil war. Well, that's exactly what did happen. There was violence, there was murder between these groups. In a sense, it carried on for a very, very long time. So Shimon HaTzadik, implies the Abarbanel, saw that not only would there be a crisis where there would be Jews led into heresy, but that itself will lead into a civil war. I often like saying, we think Hanukkah was a war of the Jews against the Greeks. It wasn't. It really wasn't. It was a war of the Jews against the Jews, the Torah true Jews against the Hellenistic Jews. When the Torah true Jews saw the Hellenistic Jews behaving in their Hellenistic ways, their approach was by and large not to invite them for Shabbos and makarev them and make them sensitive to the beauties of the Torah, but was to kill them with the sword. There was a war going on. So says Shimon HaTzadik, we've got to prepare ourselves to avoid the consequences of that war. Don't fall into a civil war situation. And that is why he said, be careful with the third of his pillars, Gemilut Chasodim. So the end of line 6, V'haita azarato al shalosha hadavarim ha'elo, and his, literally his warning, his instruction was about these three things in particular, K'tsofo mabit ad sof kaladorot, as he was looking to the future, he was looking to the end of all generations, he was looking towards the vast scope of Jewish history, Shebaloshtam yichshalu besof ba'et sheni. Because in these three areas, in Torah, in Avodah, in Gemilut Chasodim, they were stumbling at the end of Ba'et Sheni. At the end of Ba'et Sheni, they were not so proficient and versed in the Torah, which is perhaps one of the reasons why the Mishnah had to be written down, even though it was Torah Sheba'al Peh, because people were forgetting what the Torah said. At the end of Ba'et Sheni, by definition, the Beit HaMikdash was going to be destroyed, and there'd be no more Avodah, and the Jews would be fighting amongst themselves, so there'd be no more Gemilut Chasodim. So that is why, says the Abarbanel, at that particular time, roughly a third into Ba'et Sheni, that's when Shimon HaTzadik was there. The Greeks came. Shimon HaTzadik foresaw a time of exile, destruction, enmity, assimilation, and he said, these are the three things which we need to guard against. Now, I've got more from the Maharal on the page, but I think, given the time, I'm going to pause there, and then we will meet again in 3 weeks' time, and we will carry on with this.